Hello, I'm Dr. James Billis. Today we'll be covering Chapter 21, the blood vessels and circulation, in the textbook Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. Okay. The blood vessels are classified by size and histological organization. Instrumental in overall cardiovascular regulation, the largest blood vessels attached to the heart, those being the pulmonary trunk, which carries blood from the right ventricle to the pulmonary circulation, and the aorta, which carries blood from the left ventricle to the systemic circulation. Arteries, remember, carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood to the heart. Arterioles are the smallest branch of arteries that lead to capillary beds. So we have different size arteries and veins, which we'll go through. The capillaries are the smallest blood vessels with thin walls, the location of exchange between blood and interstitial fluid. And again, what is the interstitial fluid? That's the cell or the fluid between the cells and the tissue. Venules, smallest branches of veins that collect blood from the capillaries. So on the artery side, we have arterioles, which are the smallest branches. On the venous side, we have venules, which pour into the return blood of the heart to the veins. So the venules lead to the veins. So on the arterial side, we'll go from arterioles to capillaries. The venial side will go from the capillaries to the venules and then to the blood or the veins. The vessels, both arteries and the veins, have the anatomy of the artery and vein. The outer, or this would be the innermost portion of the vein, the tunica intima. The second layer wall is the tunica media, and the third layer is the tunica externa. Now, this is the anatomy of the vessels. However, that anatomy looks a little different, whether it's a artery or vein. The tunica intima, the inner layer, includes an epithelial lining, a connective tissue layer, and an internal elastic membrane in the arteries. An internal elastic membrane in the arteries. The elastic fibers in the outer margin of the tunica intima. You won't see this with the veins. The tunica media, the middle layer, contains concentric sheets of smooth muscle in loose connective tissue. Encircles the endothelium and lines the lumen, which is the opening interior space of the blood vessel. Binds to inner and outer layers. The external elastic membrane separates the tunica media from the tunica externa. We'll be able to see this in a picture shortly. The tunica externa, or outer layer, anchors vessels to adjacent tissues. Contains collagen fibers, elastic fibers, smooth muscle cells in veins. And then we have the vasovasorum. The vasovasorum, which is the vessels of the vessels. Okay, oops. Small arteries and veins in the walls of large arteries and veins. They serve cells of the tunica media and the tunica externa. All right, we see a picture of what's going on here. If we look over here to the right, we see the lumen of the artery, which is the opening here, versus the lumen of the vein. And we see some distinct differences. We see that the artery is more round than the vein. It has thicker walls. than the vein. Vein is much larger. So let's break this down a little bit. The outer portion, and what we're looking at right here, is going to be artery. We have the tunica externa, the middle layer, the tunica media, the inner layer, the tunica intima. And we see that within the tunica media, we have smooth muscle in the artery. This is going to help assist the blood to get through the arteries to where it needs to go. It's going to help create more pressure for the oxygenated blood. Let's see, the internal elastic membrane. You have to ask yourself, why would we want that membrane to be elastic? Well, think about the amount of pressure that's going to be in this artery. When we pump blood out of the ventricle, that's got to go through the aorta, through the arteries to reach deep into the capillaries and the tissues. Therefore, it's going to be a pressurized system. And as pressurized as it is, we need to hold it in place, but yet we need some elastic recoil. And so with the arteries, we're going to have some elastic recoil, and we don't want those arteries to balloon out, so to say. We want them to retain their shape as much as possible so we can build up as much pressure as needed, or more pressure as needed, to deliver the blood. So we have the external elastic membrane, endothelium elastic fibers. Features, all right, usually round as far as the artery, with thick walls. The intima is usually rippled due to the vessel constriction. The tunica media is thick, dominated by smooth muscle cells and elastic fibers. And the externa has collagen elastic fibers. The externa. In other words, again, we want to hold this shape. We don't want it to balloon out. Now the veins will balloon out when they fill with blood. They do have the ability to balloon out. We don't want that to happen with the arteries. Okay, now we're looking at a typical vein, and we're saying, let's break it down here. The tunica externa is the outer portion, the tunica media is the inner portion, or the middle portion, and the tunica intima is on the inside. Now, we do show some smooth muscle on the externa, as well as smooth muscle in the tunica media, but not as much as we saw with the artery. So when we look at that, the vein is usually flattened or collapsed with a relatively thin wall. The intima, tunica intima, inner lining, is often smooth. The internal elastic membrane is absent in the vein. It's absent in the vein. We're not looking so much for recoil in the vein, as we already said that it will distend like a balloon. The tunica media is thin, dominated by smooth muscle and collagen fibers. The external elastic membrane is absent with the vein. And the tunica externa, collagen elastic fibers and smooth muscle cells. Okay, blood vessels. The differences between arteries and veins. Arteries have thicker walls and higher blood pressure than veins. Thicker walls, higher blood pressure than veins. A constricted artery has a small round lumen. A vein has a large irregular lumen, as we saw. The endothelium of the constricted artery is folded. Arteries are more elastic than veins, and veins have valves, which we haven't seen yet, but they're one-way valves. And those valves will assist in getting the blood back to the heart. Arteries. The elasticity allows arteries to absorb pressure waves that come with each heartbeat. Okay, the elasticity is what allows the arteries to absorb pressure waves that come with each heartbeat. Contractility. The arteries change diameter controlled by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Vasoconstriction. When we say vaso, we're referencing vessels. Vasoconstriction is constriction or contraction of the arterial smooth muscle. Vasodilation is the relaxation of the arterial smooth muscle, which enlarges the lumen or the opening of the vessel. Vasoconstriction and vasodilation. The effect is it'll affect the afterload on the heart, the peripheral blood pressure, and capillary blood flow. Arteries. The heart, or from heart to capillaries. Arteries change from elastic arteries to muscular arteries to arterioles. Now let's stop here and look at this for a second. We're saying that from the aorta, which is going to be highly pressurized, the most pressurized artery, it's going to be an elastic artery. And then some of the major branches that come off of the aorta will also be elastic arteries. But then we travel down to other arteries that don't require as much elasticity. The pressure is decreasing. The further that we get from the heart, the more pressure or the reduced pressure there is. So from the elastic arteries, we go to the muscular arteries. Now the muscular arteries are further away. They're not as large, but we say that they're muscular because they have smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle contractions help to move blood further through the system to get to the capillaries, ultimately. And then those muscular arteries turn into the smallest arteries called arterioles. So we go from largest to medium sized to the smallest to get to the absolute smallest, which is the capillary beds. All right, the elastic arteries, which are the largest, they're considered conducting arteries. These are large vessels, such as the pulmonary trunk and the aorta and some of those branches coming off of those. The tunica media has many elastic fibers and few muscle cells. Mostly pressurized. We need to allow for distension. Many elastic fibers. We don't need the smooth muscle because it already has the pressure built up as it's proximal to the heart. The elasticity evens out the pulse force. Okay. Distribution arteries is another term given to the muscular arteries. Distribution arteries versus the conducting arteries, which were the elastic arteries. The muscular arteries or distribution arteries, most arteries are medium-sized muscular arteries. The tunica media has many muscle cells. Arterioles are considered to be resistant vessels. The arterioles are considered to be resistant vessels. And it's important to remember this. They're small vessels, have little or no tunica in externa. have a very thin or incomplete tunica media. So we're losing some of the layers the further into the process we get with reduced pressure. We've lost some of the layers here with the arterioles, and by the time we get to the capillary, we've even lost more. Okay. An aneurysm. It's a bulge in the arterial wall caused by a weak spot in the elastic fibers. Pressure may rupture the vessel. And we've probably heard of the aortic aneurysms. Not good. And here we're seeing a picture. Let me see if I can enlarge it a bit for you. Comparing the vein to the artery. Basically going over what we've already said, just showing you pictures with it. So we have the largest arteries, most pressure coming into the muscular arteries, or the muscular artery here. On the opposite side, we would call it a medium-sized vein. So this actually is a medium-sized artery. Large arteries are elastic. Medium-sized arteries are muscular. Notice not so much muscle with the vein. We have a different system of delivery in the venous system than we do the arterial system, which we'll talk about. And then we get to the smallest type of artery, which is the arteriole versus the venule. And then we get to the capillary beds, where we have what's called continuous capillaries and fenestrated capillaries. Continuous, meaning there's basically a covering that does not have holes in it. It's not porous. Versus fenestrated, meaning that there's holes in the covering, and things can secrete. Okay, so the veins, just a large picture talking about what we had. The tunica externa, the tunica media, the tunica intima in the medium-sized vein. We start losing some of this in the arteries. Okay. Here we're looking at continuous capillaries. Remember that capillaries can only, red blood cells will stack up and travel through the capillaries in a single file line. Anyway, we have the continuous capillary versus the fenestrated capillary. The fenestrated capillary has the pores in it. Capillaries are the smallest vessels with thin walls. Microscopic capillary networks permeate all active tissue. Capillary functions, the location of all exchange function of the cardiovascular system. Materials diffuse between blood and interstitial fluid. Capillary structure. It's an endothelial tube inside a thin basement membrane. There is no tunica media. There is no tunica externa. It's all tunica interna. The diameter is similar to that of a red blood cell. Continuous capillaries. The continuous capillaries are found in all tissues except epithelial and cartilage. They have complete endothelial lining, permit diffusion of water, small solutes, and lipid-soluble materials. They block blood cells and plasma proteins. They're specialized in continuous capillaries in the central nervous system and thymus. Have very restricted permeability, for example, the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so continuous, they're pretty picky about what they're going to let through. Fenestrated have pores. Obviously, they're going to let more things through. We're not going to think in terms of the blood-brain barrier, which doesn't want things coming through it. So fenestrated capillaries have pores in endothelial lining. They permit rapid exchange of water and large solutes found in the choroid plexus, endocrine organs, kidneys, interstitial tract or intestinal tract. And you remember we talked about the choroid plexus, which was located in the lateral ventricles of the brain, as well as the central canal of where the spinal cord lives. And it was responsible for ependymal cells making the cerebral spinal fluid, the choroid plexus. Sinusoids, or sinusoidal capillaries. These are similar, but they have gaps between the adjacent endothelial cells. They permit free exchange of water and large plasma proteins found in the liver, spleen, bone marrow, endocrine organs. Phagocytic cells monitor blood at the sinusoids. So we have three types. We have continuous capillaries, which are seen here. Basement membrane, boundary between the epithelial cells, but we've got a complete covering here. We have the fenestrated capillary. Again, think blood-brain barrier. We don't want things passing through here. Fenestrated capillary, which allows through the pores a few more larger type of things to pass through it. And then we have the sinusoid, which is also fenestrated, but it has gaps, which allow for even larger things to pass through. So those are the three types of capillaries. And we'll just cruise through here because we've seen it. Capillary beds, or capillary plexus, connect one arteriole to one venule. So between the arteriole and the venule, you will find the capillary. Precapillary sphincter. There's a sphincter that guards the entrance to each capillary. It opens and closes, causing capillary blood to flow in pulses. In pulses. A sphincter. A musculature stricture which opens and closes the lumen of the capillary. And then we have thoroughfare channels. These are direct capillary connections between arterioles and venules. So what's going to happen here is the blood coming from the arteriole is going to run into the venule or the precapillary sphincter, which will hold it up for just a bit, then release it, and it will release it to go through the thoroughfare channels of the capillaries. So what we're seeing here is the smooth muscle cells section of the precapillary sphincter. We're seeing that the sphincters are, let's see if we can find where they're. Here is the thoroughfare channel. It's in a solid black line. Solid black line. And what we're seeing is that the solid black lines are the consistent blood flow, where the variable blood flow caused by the precapillary sphincters, what you're seeing here, is going to change that flow. Okay. Typical capillary bed, solid arrows indicate constant blood flow, dashed arrows indicate variable or pulsating blood flow caused by the precapillary sphincters. Here we're seeing a picture of a small artery here to the arterioles. To the capillary beds. Collaterals. These are multiple arteries that contribute to one capillary bed. Allow circulation if one artery is blocked. There's a word that you need to remember. Collaterals. Multiple arteries that contribute to one capillary bed. Arterial anastomosis. The fusion of two collateral arteries. The fusion of two collateral arteries. And you can think of this as being, let's see, any major city, highways going into the cities. We have what they used to call mousetraps, where we have main arteries coming into the city, and then some of those main arteries for automobile travel would turn into this, oh my gosh, you can't even describe it, an anastomosis. Things going every which way. So we have collaterals and arterial anastomosis, the fusion of two collateral arteries. Arteriovenous anastomosis, direct connections between arterioles and venules. They bypass the capillary bed. Arterial venous anastomosis. They bypass the capillary bed. So we'll just take a side street and forget about the mousetrap. Okay.